Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Nihal Khan on behalf of Baitul Mal, joining you live from Hartford, Connecticut, with a special guest, part of a special series that we're starting, talking about different humanitarian crises throughout the world. Today we're going to be highlighting the situation. In Yemen right now, what has been ongoing for quite a few years. And as you all know, Baitul Mal has been active in Yemen for the past couple of years. We've actually been able to raise close to 1.3 million in emergency humanitarian aid since 2018, though it's not that large of a number compared to the fact that there are many other organizations that have done a lot more. But at the same time, we need your support so that we can, inshallah, bring that number up. Roughly, we've given out 355,000 meals out there, 300,000 tablets of antibiotics, 15,000 medical kits, and 200 hygiene kits. But we urgently need your support to continue to support our brothers and sisters in Yemen. But today, inshallah, we're going to be talking to a very special guest. We're going to be talking to Dr. Shireen Al-Adaimi, and I'm actually going to go ahead and introduce her. She is an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. Since 2015, she's played an active role in raising awareness about the Saudi-led war on her country of birth, Yemen, and works to encourage political action to end U.S. support. And me and Dr. Adaimi were speaking right before the interview. She was born and raised in Yemen and spent a majority of her adulthood in Canada, and then eventually came stateside. She did her PhD at Harvard University. And then afterwards, actually, the first time I met Dr. Shireen was at an event with Dr. Cornel West at Yale University about 2 years ago. And it was a really awesome event. We had a lot of folks there, and it was a program organized by students that were advocating on behalf of Yemen through a hunger strike, through making sure that our representatives can have us heard, and much more within the state of Connecticut. But I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to Dr. Shireen Al-Adaimi. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Adaimi. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam. I'm doing well, and thank you for having me.
Alhamdulillah, that's awesome. Cool. How's Ramadan going for you?
It's going pretty well. I have to say this Ramadan is easier than I expected, but so far so good, alhamdulillah.
Awesome. So I'm going to just, I'm curious, well, before I should get into this question, I want to ask, how did this crisis begin, number one, and why isn't it ending? I think there's been a lot of, talk about, the Saudi-backed, the USA-backed Saudi bombardment for the last few years under 3 administrations. But what exactly, is the background as to why this all started?
I mean, this could be the whole interview, right? This big question. There are multiple things that precipitated this conflict. It began as a civil unrest because of events leading up to, the 2001 Yemeni revolution, which was eventually co-opted by different power groups in Yemen, led to a situation where we had an interim president with President Hadi, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to bring people together. And within that unrest, the group that people hear about in the news called the Houthis kind of took over the capital, Sana'a, to try to apply pressure on the Hadi government at the time. So this is late 2014 now. There's been some unrest for a few years. But essentially, there was still hope of a power sharing deal. There was still hope of a unity government. And within those discussions, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, seemingly, the Saudi-led coalition began bombing. Now, why Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen is another question, because there's a long history of Saudi intervention in Yemen. Yemen is a neighbor of Saudi Arabia to the south. And, it's the poorest country in the Middle East, but strategically important because it controls Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where about 6.2 million barrels of oil travel per day to Europe and to Asia, but also where lots of other things travel. For example, most recently, people were hearing about this ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, right? But the bottom of the Red Sea is Bab el-Mandeb, where Yemen controls. And so for the Saudis, it was important to have a government there that was in support of the Saudi-led coalition, in support of Saudi Arabia, as an ally of the United States, which describes the previous dictator and the interim president, but doesn't describe the Houthi rebels who were vehemently anti-Saudi and anti-US. And so that was a problem for them. So it's an issue of control. But it's dragged on for all of these years because the United States and really the rest of the world continues to support the Saudi-led coalition despite complete failures and nothing but a gigantic toll on civilians.
Yeah, and that's what boggles my mind, right? And I think this is where it's become problematic, because to actually bring up something else, I wanted to share a letter with you all that, and I guess this comes to my second question. A lot of times we're told that, hey, if there is some American foreign policy that you are dissatisfied with, write to your representatives, right? Reach out to them, and there should be a change that occurs. And in this case, you were living in Massachusetts at this time, right? And you had reached out to the office of Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was also running for president just last year, and was seen as a more more towards the the left leaning, like not going and bombing other people's countries' politics, but yet that kind of did not seem to be the case. And I'm actually going to share a letter with you all that Dr. Shireen had written, and in the end, I'm not going to read the entire letter. You can actually read this or see the letter on indiestimes.com under Dr. Shireen al-Adami's article that she had written about reaching out to Elizabeth Warren. But at the end, the main point was that we want to support a peaceful dialogue, but supporting that peaceful dialogue in conjunction with U.S. efforts in cooperation with our allies, who were the people dropping the bombs on the Yemeni civilians. So my question is, when people see this type of a reaction, how can we go and, like this becomes disheartening, right? So what can people actually do to help our brothers and sisters out there that are struggling?
I mean, yeah. So I was thinking, and I sent the letter months after the war began, because for months it was a state of helplessness, not knowing what to do. I don't want to call for people to help, but I just wanted my own government, the U.S. government, to stop its involvement in this crisis. And so emailing Senator Warren was something that I thought, here maybe we can get the ball rolling. She could lead legislation that would get the U.S. out of Yemen. Knowing, by the way, that this war is illegal. Like Obama had no authority to go into war. In fact, no president actually has any authority to go into war. It's within the purview of Congress. And yet receiving a letter like this from Elizabeth Warren was extremely disheartening, disappointing, because if this is one of the most progressive members of Congress telling me that, we're supporting efforts, and there were no diplomatic efforts, there were bombs being thrown on civilians every single day, right? An average of 30 bombs a day for the past 6 years. So there were no diplomatic efforts here. And discussing this as a point of security for the Saudi allies was deeply concerning. But what do you do? You continue to fight, because in that moment, I think I felt very lonely. I felt like, well, if this is what members of Congress are saying, who should not be saying this thing, then I could either, give up hope, or I can just keep going and get whoever will listen to me to be involved in this and to apply pressure, because we are their constituents and they have to respond to us. If we are bringing this issue up into town halls, and if we're writing and calling, especially because they see phone calls as more valuable, I think, than emails and letters, because they think that, it's a lot more people behind the phone call. And so if we continue to do that, my thinking was, and still is, that we can change U.S. policy toward Yemen.
Yeah, and not only that, there was some good news that followed that, right? I think Senator Bernie Sanders and my Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut eventually ended up passing the War Powers Act, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah,
so your Senator Chris Murphy was the lone Democrat calling out against this war since 2015. And he was joined by a Republican, Rand, who is just anti kind of certain wars. And so they were the first to bring about kind of this concern that, I remember Senator Murphy saying, there's a U.S. footprint on every bomb in Yemen and every casualty in Yemen, there's a U.S. footprint. And so they eventually, Chris Murphy and Senator Sanders and a group of bipartisan Congress people and also Ro Khanna in the House, brought about the War Powers Resolution. The War Powers Resolution is this law that I was mentioning earlier, that it's illegal for the president to go to war. But since its creation in 1973, and this federal law, by the way, was passed because journalists found they found leaks about the secret wars that President Nixon was conducting in Laos, I believe. And so they passed this resolution to ensure that a president can't just declare war without Congress. Every president since Nixon has violated this, but no Congress has ever stood up to a president until 2019, when they passed the War Powers Resolution for Yemen. So it was a gigantic deal. It took several years to pass, so many hurdles in Congress. And of course,
but secret wars, can you kind of let the audience know about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the U.S. administration is always involved in something or the other. And while the Vietnam War was going on, this idea of repressing communism was such a big thing back in the 70s and the 60s, and so in 1973, Nixon was also bombing countries in East Asia that were not, it was besides the Vietnam War, he was bombing Laos and Cambodia and countries like that. And these were happening secretly. So the U.S. didn't even know, the U.S. public didn't even know about it for a very long time. And when journalists uncovered that, it was a major scandal. And so it led to the War Powers Act to try to ensure that a president can't just go rogue and declare war on somebody else without telling anybody about it, that this was something that had to pass through Congress. But then, of course, Iraq happened, Presidents Clinton, Bush, both Bushes, all of them have gone to war without Congress. And so it's not been followed necessarily.
Yeah, and I think right now, I mean, when we look at it, especially with your most recent article talking about how, that the President Biden, as of this point, is basically, ending the Yemen war. But I think you had brought about saying that that's fine and dandy, but it's not. It reminds me of the time when Obama was elected, and he was like, one of the first things he did via executive action was, I think, sign to close Guantanamo Bay. And here we are, 2008 to 2021, 12 years later, and, same situation. Nothing exactly has happened. And, and now we're looking at an administration that, and I think right now there are certain things that, and obviously we don't judge politicians purely as people, that we judge them by their administration and the legislation that they pass and the policies they put into play. But at this point, there may be things like, okay, yes, Biden did stop the Muslim ban, or Biden did do X, Y, and Z things. But I think when it comes to recovering as a nation, to rebuild your infrastructure, to rebuild the morale of the people, is such a, it's an effort that takes more than just signing a piece of document, right? And I think that was to the point you were trying to allude to, that there's just so much more to get into than just signing a piece of legislation ending the war.
And you know what? He didn't even sign anything. And this is what's really disconcerting about the situation in Yemen. President Biden made that announcement in early February. And since then, certain members of Congress wrote a letter saying, okay, can you show us exactly what you mean by this? Because he gave a very vague statement. And that's what I wrote that article after I spent the afternoon essentially celebrating or crying out of just relief, right, that this was finally ending. And then when the announcement actually came on, and I listened to every single word he said, I realized that there's a lot going on here that's not very clear. So all of a sudden, he's saying that I'm going to end the offensive operations in Yemen. Well, wait, why? What is the difference here between offensive and defensive? If President Obama back in 2015 was also saying, this is a defensive war, right? And so What is this rebranding? Then he was saying he's going to review certain relevant weapon sales. So there's a lot that was left unsaid. And Congress pushed President Biden to explain what exactly he's doing in Yemen. He said that he's ending intelligence sharing, but the reality is that there's been no proof of anything. And in the last couple of months, the war has escalated. The blockade has been more tightly enforced. More Yemenis are dying on the ground. And President Biden has come out, his administration has denied even the existence of a blockade. And so I'm really concerned about moving forward.
So it was just him saying that, hey, we're going to end the war in Yemen. That's all it was.
And I'm baffled that Congress won't pass another War Powers Resolution. When this was Trump's war, they passed a bipartisan War Powers Resolution. which would have, if it would have forced the end of the war if the president signed it. Biden is, of course, going to sign that. It would look very bad for him to veto something like that. And yet they haven't challenged him in this way.
So then the question that comes is that, people, and I think your parakeets agree with you, because I hear them in the background, but what do you call it? We actually had someone that we'd interviewed, like the cat that come up onto the keyboard. It would be pretty cool. So
I have to say, it's not a parakeet. It's the sparrow that I rescued in the summer. He had fallen out of his nest, and even though I turned his music off, he's still singing. He wants to join the conversation.
Cool. It's all good. We got to hear the voice of the people. It's important to keep that in mind. So, but no, I guess the question then comes, what is the point for a president to, at this point, especially, coming out of a campaign of mistruths, of untruths, of lies, to then make a statement and not follow it up with any action?
I mean, it's a rebranding, and this is what I've been worried about, because this war didn't start with the Trump administration, right? So there's nothing to undo that Trump had started. So the Muslim ban is very easy to undo that, because it makes him look good. Oh, look, this should have never happened. I didn't do this. I'm undoing it. But his administration, he was part of the administration that started this war. And during the Obama years, it was like screaming into the void. Nobody would listen to us when we were trying to end this war. And so it only really picked up steam when it was seen as evil Trump's war, and yet Biden now seems to be rebranding this war, and it's business as usual, because he's trying to find a way out for the Saudis, who are close allies, as you can tell, but at the expense of the Yemeni people, and while making it look like they're concerned about the humanitarian situation and whatnot.
Yeah, that's really sad. Which actually brings me to my next point. I know this is probably something very personal to you. I'm sure you have committed your own studies to studying this. But how has the current crisis affected you and your family?
I mean, this is, our families back home are suffering, and you can speak to any Yemeni, any of us in the diaspora. Every single person will have stories of loss of family members who've been displaced. Us living abroad, I mean, I can't compare, of course, my anxiety to what they're going through, but it's just been constant anxiety about and worry about, their safety, right? So when a bomb is dropping, or 30 bombs on average per day, you worry that one of those is going to be your family members, right? When there's a blockade and people are stuck and they're looking to you for help, you can't, you've not heard of the massive refugee crisis out of Yemen, because most people are trapped. The airspace is controlled, the land is controlled, the sea ports are controlled by the Saudi-led coalition, and so most people are trapped within. So there's displacement. Some people have passed away because of medicines that they can't access, because of healthcare that's non-existent. Some people have been displaced and killed, like I said. So, I mean, it's extremely painful, but at the same time, those in Yemen who have family abroad, sadly, are the lucky ones, because at least if somebody loses a job, or if somebody doesn't have something to eat, we can send some money over. But, most people in Yemen don't have somebody to wire them money. And so it's been really devastating for them. But for us over here, for me, I just keep going. I don't have a choice to not advocate for an end to this war, because our loved ones back home don't have a choice. They have to endure what's been imposed on them by these Muslim neighbors, who are the world's richest countries and their Western allies. And so if they have to endure, then surely we can do what we can. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, I remember when I was looking at one of the first articles you had written about this, right? Talking about the House Concurrent Resolution 81, the bipartisan bill introduced by Ro Khanna and some other senators to end the United States support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And I assume that, back in 2018, I think that was kind of brought to the floor. I mean, has anything occurred beyond that we can positively say, hey, this really kind of helped curtail to some degree, or,
Nothing has helped. The situation on the ground is just as bad. And so, for example, under Trump, the U.S. stopped refueling Saudi jets midair. Okay, great. They've taught the Saudis and the Emiratis how to do it, but they're still dropping bombs. They're still selling them the weapons. They're still training their pilots. They're still helping them maintain vehicles and aircrafts, even when those vehicles and aircrafts weren't purchased by from the United States. So if they bought them from the UK or from Canada, for example, the US Army still has contracts with the Saudi-led coalition to service those vehicles and aircrafts. They help them choose targets from the command room. They help them enforce the blockade. And so every step of the way, the United States is helping. And they've only stopped minor issues here because they figured out that, oh, they can do this part on their own now. And so nothing has changed. And, you know, we talk about the bombing, but it's also the blockade. And the blockade is what's causing the most suffering. And yet we have an administration
into the country. Like,
you can't get anything into the country without Saudi's approval. And so, you know, they'll celebrate, they'll say, oh, look, there's no blockade. We just allowed 4 ships in. Well, what about the rest of the ships that are waiting? What about the fuel crisis that you've created? You know, and the fact that you're saying that you are allowing ships into the country means there is a blockade, right? There is a blockade, and the Saudis are enforcing this blockade. And the really messed up thing about this too is that this is under UN cover, because UN Security Resolution 2216 calls on Saudi Arabia and Yemen's neighbors to patrol the waters and to check all shipments coming in to make sure that there are no weapons coming in from Iran. So the Saudis have used that arms embargo to essentially check everything that's going in and deciding what to enter, what can enter, what can't enter, essentially using starvation as a weapon of war when the bombing hasn't gotten them what they wanted to do.
And I'm wondering, from the Obama to Trump to Biden administrations, like, I'm sure it's only gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. And not only that, in between, you had the transition of power, right? Well, you know, when King Salman, I guess, you know, took over and then eventually deputized his son to run things, that all of this occurred in this period. So like, you know, I'm just wondering, like, that must just be horrible for the Yemeni people, like, just seeing things in front of them just get worse and worse and worse.
It just keeps getting worse. And this started, by the way, when Mohammed bin Salman, when his father became king in January, and just 2 months later, this started. And so at the time, he was deputy crown prince and defense minister. Nobody knew who he was, and this was his resume war. He even had the audacity to call this decisive storm. He thought this was going to be over in a couple of weeks, you know? So you have this mentality that, yeah, we can just come in and change the course of an entire country, bomb their people. Oh, that's not working. Okay, let's target food, you know, supplies. And oh, that's not working either. Okay, let's enforce this blockade. And the rest of the world is like, yeah, sure. How much money can we make out of this? You know, and this is the sad reality for Yemenis. And so when I spoke to Yemenis about, you know, Biden ending the war, I spoke to one person. I wrote an article about this, and his daughter was killed. His 19-month-old daughter was killed in July of 2015. This was when Obama's administration was in power. And he said, I remember Biden being part of that administration. I'm not going to believe that he has any incentive to end the war that killed my daughter. You know, like, he was part of that administration. So they're not going to believe that anything is actually happening until the blockade is lifted, until these bombs stop dropping on them.
Which also brings me to think about this. It's just like, what is the incentive of the U.S. to be a part of this, and to to kind of clean their hands, of saying that, hey, we're just protecting our sovereignty and protecting Saudis? Like, what is the benefit that they're getting out of it outside of the U.S.-Saudi alliance?
So there's the U.S.-Saudi alliance. There's Yemen's strategic location, because, you know, the U.S. has a say. I mean, this conflict with Iran is so big because of Hormuz as well, right? The other choke point. And so the U.S. has interest in those areas that it needs to maintain. The Saudi-U.S. relationship is very, very strong and important. And this followed very shortly after the Iran deal, where the U.S. was secretly making, behind closed doors, making this deal with Iran, and the Saudis felt left out. And so this war came about. And I've been told by people in the Biden administration that they felt like they needed to work with the Saudis because of what happened with the Iran deal. So it's not like this is the only reason, but, basically the Yemeni people are, the civilians, that doesn't factor in, their suffering doesn't factor into this. What factors into this is how much money can U.S. weapon manufacturers make, and not just the weapon manufacturers, but the U.S., but the Pentagon, through these contracts that they have with Saudi Arabia that total at least $123 million per month. This is in addition to weapon sales, but also, working with the Saudis and the strategic location of Yemen and ensuring that they look at Yemen from the security point of view. They had enabled dictators in that region, including Yemen's dictator, because they thought he was a strong ally in the war, quote unquote, war against terror, and so they can't let it go, essentially. They have to have control in that area.
And for those of you that are listening, we live within the auspices of American exceptionalism, right? Like a lot of us, even as American Muslims, like we are Muslim, and that's fine and dandy, but we live in a very high economic privilege that many people throughout the world, do not have. And to read some numbers to you all, this is from Dr. Lademi's article from 2019, where it's basically stating that these numbers are from 2019, and Dr. Lademi, you can inshallah update us about this, but 91,600 people killed since 2015, and 85,000 children that have died, right? 85,000 children have died because of hunger and illness. And we aren't talking about this, right? Like we're like, the hypocrisy, unfortunately, and the fact that we need to take a very good look in the mirror as to what the American soul has become. On one end, you have people just dropping dead from gun violence. And then on the other end, when a non-American life is taken or it passes, we're not ones to speak out about it. We're not ones to talk about it. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the numbers could just, there's no confirmation exactly about how much the loss is, but right now that number is well over 100,000 people killed in the violence. And just this year alone, so it used to be that one child was dying every 10 minutes, one child under the age of 5. So we're not even talking about all children here or all people. We're talking about children, this very vulnerable children, between ages 0 and 5. And now it's one child every 75 seconds. And let's think about that. A child every 75 seconds is being starved to death because the US and the Saudis and the Emiratis want to control Yemen, colonize it, occupy parts of it, take its resources and force a government onto them that they want. And so I don't even know what the total is. This year alone, the UN is warning that this year alone, a child every 75 seconds, that number adds up to 400,000 children. 400,000 children are going to die this year if things go on as is. And this is just the children we're talking about. So imagine what their mothers are going through, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, all of these people in Yemen who are suffering. 30 million people in Yemen, and 80% of them need humanitarian aid just to survive, 16 million on the brink of famine. And so we're talking about a catastrophe unlike any other in the world. It's been the world's worst humanitarian crisis since 2016, and it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, and I'm thinking even to myself, like I say, it's ethnic cleansing, right? And it's to an extent that nobody wants to use that term. It's uncomfortable. But before this happened, for those that are familiar with, the politics and situation of the area, Yemen and Saudi Arabia have not had good relations. They have not been on good terms. And now it's like, oh, now we have a chance, now we have a chance to make something of this effort. And I just feel like, as humans, to speak out, right? As humans that will speak out against white supremacy, that will speak out against the ethnic cleansing of Jews, that will speak out against the mass murder of Bengalis by Winston Churchill. Like, why is it that in 2021, obviously, we are also seeing this on the other end of the world with our Uyghur brothers and sisters, right? Like, there is ethnic cleansing taking place. There is mass murder taking place, to one extent, yes, through starving them, on the other extent through concentration camp. But now in the situation of Yemen, it's happening. Yet everyone, I think, is more silent about Yemen than they are about other faces. With the Uyghurs, and again, not to compare, but the Uyghurs, you do see, because there are interests there are American interests in defeating China. There's people speaking out about the Uyghurs, but unfortunately, who is supporting Yemen, like at an international level?
No one, Nihat, right? People will say Iran. There's no evidence to suggest that Iran is supporting the Houthis at that level. And again, I mentioned that the country is under a blockade enforced by all of these other countries, right? And so if food and medicine can't come in, but we're led to believe that somehow Iran is sending these weapons to the Houthis. And so the other side of this, and it doesn't really matter what's happening on the ground. It so happens right now that the Houthis are resisting this war, but they're not the only ones, right? Like the Yemenis, whether they're Houthi or not, have joined in this effort. And at the end of the day, they need to decide what's best for them. And if they decide that the Houthis are not great for them, everybody's got blood on their hands, including the Houthis. But if they decide that, this isn't what best for us, then they will continue to resist, because what people don't understand about Yemenis is that they have worked really, really hard for a government that's representative. It's the only country in that area that is a republic. It's not a monarchy. Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, these are all monarchies, absolute monarchies. Yemen is a republic. Yemenis have kicked out the British in the south in the 60s. They've kicked out the Ottomans in the north. They've gotten rid of a monarchy in the north. And there's a spirit of democracy. And then they came out in 2011 and toppled down a dictator. So what they've been able to accomplish is incredible. And they will continue to fight until they have a government that works for them. But how can they have a chance when all of these countries are intervening? And it's not that the world is silent. The world is actually benefiting from this carnage under the pretense of bringing the legitimate president of Yemen to power. Now, let's talk about that for just a second so that people can understand why there's been silence about Yemen. So technically, Yemen's president, UN recognized president, is calling onto the Saudis to support him in this war. And so people say, well, it's, he's a UN recognized president, we're going to support him. That's the equivalent of Trump deciding that, you know what, I'm going to call on to Russia or China or whoever to help me and wage the civil war and, bomb my way back into power. The man has no authority in Yemen. He hasn't been able to set foot in Yemen without his life being threatened. He's based in Saudi Arabia, and yet the world seems to kind of turn a blind eye because it's convenient. It's like, well, it's on the behest of a Yemeni president, but they're making so much money out of it. So why should they stop? So countries like Canada, even, and Germany and Italy and Spain and all of these countries are selling weapons or hiring mercenaries, to work in Yemen. And Yemenis are just left on their own. There is no other side that's been supporting them, whether it's through food or through weapons or whatever it is, right? They're kind of left on their own on this one.
And then what is the intended eventual Saudi goal of this, embargo? Like, what is it that they're, is it, yeah.
That's like asking, why did the US continue to wage war in Vietnam when there was so much internal resistance, right? And it dragged on for so long. And it wasn't until, American soldiers were coming back in body bags that people here started saying, no, this needs to stop because it's affecting us too. The problem is there are no veterans of the Yemen war. We don't conduct war in that way anymore. Our government just, contracts out what they need to do, right? Without sending a single US soldier to the ground in Yemen. But the end goal for Saudi Arabia has always been occupation and forcing a president onto Yemen. And even with the world's help, they have not been able to do that. And so it just continues out of hubris, because it's quite embarrassing for them to lose essentially to a group of people who don't even have an air force or a navy. The Houthis don't have any of these sophisticated weapons. They have some missiles and they fight on the ground. But they seem to want to have something to be able to save face. And so the United States continues to support them. The UAE has other intentions in Yemen. It's been occupying, it's probably going to annex this island of Socotra. It's been operating secret prisons that have tortured people. It ran an assassination campaign in the south of Yemen against, suspected Islamists, right? So the UAE has other intentions, but the Saudis have just been wanting to bomb and starve people into submission.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking about it from one of the other articles that you had brought up here, talking about hit the 4-year mark in 2019, right? And it's really interesting because even the UN is calling this the worst humanitarian crisis, and it makes you sometimes wonder: is this a publicity stunt? That if you're going to sit there and get all the nations of the world together and then say this is a humanitarian crisis happening, and yet no one does nothing, like what message are we sending?
Let me tell you a story. Back in 18 or 19, Ban Ki-moon, who is the former UN Secretary General, listed Saudi Arabia on this symbolic list of child killers. It's this list of countries and groups that target children, right? And he listed Saudi Arabia on that list because of the atrocities that they were committing in Yemen. Within 72 hours, Saudi Arabia was lifted from that list. And he gave a press conference and he admitted that the reason he lifted Saudi Arabia was because of financial pressure, because the Saudis were saying, well, we're not going to fund your programs in Gaza. We're not going to fund your UNESCO programs in Syria and in other places. And so he felt like he had no choice but to lift them from this list. And so that's how the UN operates. Even though it's supposed to be this independent kind of, entity, their funding relies on countries like the US and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, these very rich donors. And so even though these countries are the cause of the destruction in Yemen, you have these UN conferences where UN is calling onto these countries to pledge money to support Yemenis, and then they don't end up pledging, or this last conference that happened in March, they were calling for 4 billion. I think they didn't even get to 2 billion, and yet they thank these donors for donating. I mean, it makes no sense. So Yemenis are looking at this and saying, well, you're complicit too. Ask Yemenis on the ground and they'll say, well, everybody's left us behind, including the UN, because there has not been anyone really saying, we need to sanction these countries involved here. We need to make sure that these civilians in Yemen are protected. The same countries that seem to be caring about human rights and whatnot are either benefiting or just kind of watching and letting it happen.
Yeah. And, we're hoping that, inshallah, that through continued effort, through continued, speaking out about the issue and also consistently engaging with our political system, that we're able to find relief and comfort and ease for our Yemeni brothers and sisters, inshallah. We're going to take a quick break, and we're just going to go ahead and show you all a quick video about So I just realized that I had done a screen share, but the screen share doesn't actually allow the sound to come out. So I'm actually going to go ahead and replay the video in a different way so that it's able to show it, because I'm sure we have viewers that are like, those are really strong images without any sound, though it doesn't help us. So I'm going to just put this video up real quick, and then we should be able to see it.
Every year around the world, natural disasters, civil unrest, extreme poverty, and deadly diseases drive people from their homes, turn families' lives upside down, and keep communities struggling. For many, all that is left is hope. Hope that the water they drink won't make them sick. Hope that they have enough food to survive another day. Hope that they have a safe place to stay and rest their head tonight. Hope that help will come and that someone, somewhere, cares. You are their hope. And together, we are their family. Join us as we respond to emergencies with life-saving food, water, medicine, hygiene, and shelter. Sustain families with meals, water wells, sanitation, and healthcare. And empower communities to thrive with life-enriching programs to rise above poverty and improve their lives. We deliver hope to people in need around the world. Turn your compassion into hope.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Sorry, my mic was muted, but we are here with Dr. Shireen Al-Ademi, and she is a PhD from Harvard University and a professor at Michigan State University, and somebody that has written very extensively on the current crisis in Yemen. And we encourage you all to follow her at Shireen818 online on Twitter, and also please check her profile out on indiestimes.com, referencing all of the different articles she has written. But we're going to, inshallah, get right back into our discussion with Dr. Al-Ademi. Dr. Al-Ademi, what can the average person do right now to help our brothers and sisters in Yemen who are currently going through this insurmountable, difficult situation right now?
Thanks for asking that. I think if people can help, with donations, of course, I would always encourage that. But most importantly, Yemenis wouldn't have needed donations and wouldn't need donations if the blockade if the blockade is lifted and if the bombing stops. And so I think if Americans are listening to this, people here in the US, we need to realize that this war is our war, and it's happening with our tax dollars, it's happening under our name, right? Like, this isn't just some conflict happening far away. Well, poor Yemenis, they've got to sort their issues out. And I have had, by the way, Muslim Americans tell me, well, Yemenis need to sort their issues out. Sure, but how when the US and all these countries are bombing and blockading? And so I would encourage folks to reach out to their representatives and to apply pressure. This has to be the issue. When we're engaged in the world's worst humanitarian crisis, you called it ethnic crisis, ethnic cleansing. I've used the word genocide because really the definition fits. And yet we are we have these blinders on. We don't want to engage with it. We think it's too complicated. It's not complicated. The complicated part is irrelevant to this. The most clear part here is that our government is involved in the starvation of millions of people, and that needs to end, right? And so applying pressure, contacting your representatives, calling them, showing up at town halls and challenging them on why they haven't passed the War Powers Resolution for Yemen, why they're not challenging Biden more forcefully, as forcefully as they did Trump, right? When this war, in fact, has only gotten worse in the last couple of years. And so that's what we need to do. We need to call for an end to US intervention in Yemen, not support. Support comes in the form of reparation. This is the right of Yemenis to receive reparation for what has happened to them by these countries, including the United States. But it's not a charity case. It's not a charity case to say, well, the US needs to put in money because of Yemeni struggling. No, the US needs to undo or try to undo some of the damage it has done in Yemen.
Yeah. And I think with the blockade, how can people on the ground assist in trying to get the blockade lifted? Because I'm sure donations, you said, will help, but what, maybe 4%, 5%, the small, as you mentioned. Yeah, we let it's like the thing which you had mentioned, the US will pat itself on its back for letting a relief truck in. It's I'm not racist. I have 2 black friends.
Exactly.
Right? It's the exact same mentality. But I'm just how can we, assist in trying to get this blockade lifted? And is it just reaching out to our reps, or is there more on the work direct things that we can do?
I mean, there is no way to make sure that there's okay. So before the war began, Yemen used to import 90% of its food and fuel and medicine and things like that. So this is a country highly dependent on imports. Commercial imports have been severely restricted by the Saudi-led coalition. So 80% of the population became reliant on aid, and then aid is used as a weapon. For example, the Trump administration just cut aid altogether to northern Yemen. Biden has said that he's going to reinstate it. But what can people do? I'm going to tell you about a group of Yemeni American women right now who are on day 21 of a hunger strike. Iman and Muna Saleh are Yemeni American sisters from Dearborn, Michigan, and they traveled to DC and they've been camping outside the White House for 3 weeks now. Today is day 21. They're with Yemeni Liberation Movement at Liberate Yemen on Twitter. And they have been putting themselves through this hunger strike to pressure the Biden administration to lift the blockade, to end its support for the blockade. The U.S. is saying there's no blockade. There is a blockade. The U.S. is saying we're not supporting the blockade. Well, they're certainly not speaking out against it. So just Biden using his diplomatic pressure to tell the Saudis to lift the blockade, that's if there's concerns that the U.S. Navy is actually enforcing the blockade as well. But I would encourage folks to follow at Liberate Yemen and the hunger strikers, Muna and Iman Saleh, and to, lead. Yemeni American women especially have led this fight, this anti-war, anti-imperialist fight for the last 6 years. Myself, Dr. Aisha Jaman, who is with Yemeni, a US-based charity called Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, yeah, thanks for pulling this up. Jihan Hakim of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. So Yemeni women are leading this work, and we would love to have allies in this work. Just follow our lead, kind of thing, with this, and also be calling your Congress people.
And I think just was it last week or the week before, Ilhan Omar had come to basically meet with them right outside where they were camping out.
Yes, Ilhan Omar came down twice, actually, and there was a moment she gave a press conference when she was holding back tears because she met with Iman and she spoke to Iman. And I had an event with Iman yesterday. If folks haven't seen this film, it's an Oscar-nominated film called Hunger Ward. And these two American men went to Yemen and they filmed what starvation looks like in Yemen, one clinic in the south of Yemen and one clinic in the north. And it is, it was nominated for this Oscar. It is the most heartbreaking movie you'll ever see, but it's also not in the past. It's right now, it's happening right now. And Iman and Aisha and I were engaged in the conversation yesterday, and I was just shocked to even see Iman because I've seen her before she went on this hunger strike. She consulted with me before she went. And just seeing her now after 3 weeks, for her to put herself through this, tells you how desperate we are, how desperate Yemeni Americans are for people to hear us out, for people to support our cause, for people to help us end the blockade, end weapon sales, end the destruction that's being imposed upon our people in Yemen.
Yeah, and it's just, honestly, Dr. Zimi, I personally, am aware, right, of what's happening, but I'm not Yemeni, right, and I'm not of Yemeni origin. And not only that, because there are so many folks that are centered within the American narrative as to, hey, these are the people you should support for relief, and these are the people, well, we're not going to actually support them. We're not going to say not to support them, but by the mere fact you're not mentioning them, they're not going to get any support. They're not going to get any sympathy. But I guess post with Ilhan coming down, has there been, and has there been any, action after the hunger strike or anything, any movement on this issue?
Yeah, so the hunger strikers, in coordination with another group of us, have written a letter, and we got 75 members of Congress to sign this letter to Biden to tell him to pressure the Saudis to lift the blockade. And his response was to deny the existence of the blockade. But 75 members of Congress signed on to this blockade letter. And then concurrently, I was a signatory on this, but over 70 organizations and then individuals and celebrities signed another letter also pressuring Biden to lift the blockade. So there's a lot of awareness that the hunger strikers and all of this work that we've been doing has helped, shed light. People are learning about the blockade on Yemen for the first time, and voices that are saying, well, there's no blockade, people who support the Saudi-led coalition. And you will find many Yemeni Americans and other Arab Americans and other Americans who support the Saudi-led coalition and who'll say that there's no blockade. Then there's a CNN investigation that came out, a couple months ago with Naima al-Bagir, who found she smuggled herself into Yemen when they wouldn't give her a visa. And she showed evidence of this fuel blockade and showed the trucks waiting to move with all of this food that they're trying to deliver that they can't because there's no fuel. Yeah. Hospitals are running out of fuel. Children are dying. Imagine all the things that you require fuel for, and it's just being completely blocked. And after that reporting, the Saudis allowed 4 ships in. Now, these ships have all received clearance by the UN, by the way. So even after receiving clearance by the UN, they stopped them. David Beasley of the World Food Program has said that, the blockade must be lifted immediately. Otherwise, all of these people are going to starve. And this is going to be the worst famine in modern history, is what he said. And so it's urgent. We have this hashtag that we've had for a long time called Yemen Can't Wait, and they really cannot wait. This is such an urgent matter. And you know what, Nihal, I just also have to say that it doesn't matter if people aren't Yemeni. It doesn't matter if you don't know there's right and there's wrong. I was in college when the Iraq war started, and we were out there protesting with everybody else, trying to get our Canadian government at the time not to enter this war. Whether it's the cause of Palestinians or, like you see injustice somewhere, anywhere, and it's your fellow human being. And I hope that people will come out and support us, even if they don't feel like, well, am I doing the right thing here? The right thing to do. And the right thing is that no matter what is happening in a country, violence is not the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just, I think this is the article that you were talking about.
Yes, absolutely. This has been an incredibly useful, people don't really trust what's happening until a Western source like CNN confirms it, essentially, right? The blockade has been happening since 2015, but this is an investigation that has moved the needle a little bit.
Yeah. And wow, and I'm looking at this. Wow. The population that's the least level of food insecurity. Look at this.
And those areas are where 70% of the population lives. And so that's the most concentrated area of Yemen, in this northwest region that the Houthis control. And look at that. Look at the need.
Yeah, that's something. But do you have any other closing remarks before we inshallah close out? I mean, it's been a very informative interview, and I hope we can have more people becoming aware of this, right, and talking about this. But that event that we did at Yale, the way that Cornell spoke about the Yemeni people, the way most American intellectuals will not talk about them, right, or don't know about them, and I was just very I was very inspired by that point. I remember seeing what the young people at Yale were doing to bring, this as a humanitarian issue to the forefront is something that so many folks, unfortunately, just don't even know about, right? Like the average American doesn't even know what's happening in Yemen. It just boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Cornel West has been an ally with us for a long time because he's somebody who speaks out against injustice. And there is, I'm seeing this message in the chat, there is an intentional blacking out in the media, because think about how people can justify this. You can't justify it. You see starving children, a child is dying every 75 seconds. What can you say to the people watching this? How can you justify that our own government is enforcing this blockade that's killing people? Our own government is bombing these kids. If they survive the bombing, they're not going to survive the starvation or the cholera or the coronavirus rates that are the highest in the world, by the way, and they're now going through another uptick. And so there's no way to justify this. So many mainstream sources, unfortunately, they're very partisan, and they've just chosen to, well, if we don't report it, it doesn't exist, right? And so I think that's the sad reality of this, but it's not too late. It's not too late for people to join us, even if they feel like they knew about this, but they didn't do anything. That's okay. It's not too late, because we really need as many voices as possible. I want to highlight that and maybe you can find this clip, but on January 25th, there was an event that was organized. It was called World Says No to War on Yemen. And it was over 370 organizations came together from across the world in solidarity with Yemenis. And Dr. Cornel West spoke at that event, as well as Jeremy Corbyn and several parliamentarians in Europe. And I was included in the program as well. And there was this intense solidarity. The Zoom webinar maxed out within seconds. It was 1,000 people. And then over 16,000 people were watching live on Facebook and in different areas. And they came out in solidarity with the people of Yemen against Western intervention in Yemen. And for me, that was incredibly heartwarming, because here was something that I felt very lonely advocating against back in 2015. There you go. Stop the War Coalition was a big partner in this. And Middle East Eye did this this video kind of highlighting the main events, the main program, and highlighting the story. But whether it's this coalition that came together to put pressure on Biden and our Western governments for supporting it, or the hunger ward team that came together and made this film, and then came to us Yemeni Americans and said, how can we help you? We made this film, it was incredibly heartbreaking. How can you use this film in your own advocacy? And so that's, for me, incredibly heartwarming and gives me hope that there is an end in sight. You can't just kill the entire people of Yemen, we're going to continue working, and as difficult as it is, until the blockade is lifted, until weapon sales end, until support ends. In a just world, of course, people would be going to criminal court for this, but we know that that's not going to happen. But at the very least, we need justice for the Yemeni people.
Jazakallah khair. Where can people find you to see what work you're, what you're working on and whatnot?
Yeah, so I've kind of dedicated my Twitter to this advocacy. So I'm at Shireen818, just starting on Instagram. So I'm not sure I quite know how to use it either. I really recommend everybody watch Hunger Ward as well. It's 41 minutes, but it's incredibly moving. And then to go to hungerward.org and to see resources there and ways to support the cause, and it's nominated for an Oscar, and so I hope people will tune in, and if they can vote for it, can vote. Yes, there you go. And to really center Yemenis at the end of the day. The Yemeni civilians can't be held as pawns, so lifting the blockade unconditionally, not using it as a negotiating chip, and using diplomacy. The Biden administration should be able to use diplomacy to pressure its allies to end their own involvement, so Yemenis can have a chance to sit and work things out. Because guess what? They're poor, they're brown, they've been struggling for a long time, but they know what's best for them, and they can sort out their own issues without anyone's intervention.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shireen Al-Ademi. And thank you all to everyone that was listening and that was online with us. Where we have Facebook, we have Periscope, we have YouTube as well, alhamdulillah. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to make sure you're following Dr. Shireen Al-Ademi on her Twitter and now on her Instagram, right? Give her support there. And at the same time, please continue to support Baitul Mal, continue to support their efforts also in providing relief to our brothers and sisters in Yemen. We're going to go off stream now. Thank you, everyone.